Hey, how's it going, guys, and welcome back. So in today's video, I wanted to have a quick discussion with you guys about monster taming games that, at least in my opinion, deserve sequels and how I would see those sequels come to fruition. Now, that being said, there are obvious choices for games that will in fact have sequels or have sequels in development already, like Coromon 2, Nexomon 3, Disc Creatures World, Shin Megami Tensei 6 probably, etc. We're not going to be talking about those games though, because I've already done so in a video where I discussed developers that we should be supporting since they're staying in the genre, but instead what we're going to be doing is speculating a bit and going over games that don't have confirmed sequels, but in my opinion should. So as per the usual, make sure to sit back, relax, and let's dive in. Alright, so I'm going to be doing this in less of a typical list format. We're just going to kind of keep things dynamic and switch between games sort of off the cuff, but right off the bat, what comes to mind, at least in my opinion, is Monster Sanctuary 2. Now, don't get it twisted. The developers are making a new monster taming game called Aethermancer, which may or may not have nods to Monster Sanctuary in terms of like shared monsters and Easter eggs and stuff like that. However, if I'm not mistaken, this is taking place in its own separate universe from the Monster Sanctuary one. That being said, either a Monster Sanctuary 2 or a Monster Sanctuary 0/prequel would be pretty damn hype. I wanted to start with this one because I think it's one of those games that would probably need the least amount of changes in terms of gameplay, but essentially I'd expect them to keep the Metroidvania and 3-on-3 turn-based combat intact. It's honestly perfect. Perhaps they could expand by adding new skills, and of course the monster roster can get a bit bigger, but in terms of setting, I feel like Monster Sanctuary did a pretty good job of tying itself up with the plot. However, I do think a cool idea would be to explore the land during the time in which the Forgotten World existed, or at least during the original conflict that led to the birth of the Monster Sanctuary itself. This obviously would be more of a prequel than a sequel. However, I think that this would be a great avenue for them to explore in a potential second Monster Sanctuary game. Another game whose formula I don't think needs to be changed too much, but could definitely use some improvements, would be a Monster Crown 2, which, I mean, there's tons of ways that they could expand on the story, and honestly, I think there's probably another Monster Crown game coming at some point. I know they've been teasing like DLC for the original, but I think a complete overhaul of the game's systems from the ground up could go a long way, especially since Monster Crown is one of those games that has so many unique mechanics that set it apart. It would be an honest shame not to see more entries in the franchise. There are already so many fusion combinations and monsters, then you have different types of transformations on top of that, so I'm not sure if the actual systems themselves need expanding. Honestly, I think more of a story-driven sequel with the same monsters and mechanics just sharpened and expanded a little bit would go a long way. The devs are currently working on a trading card game, so maybe if that does well, we could see funds from that make its way to the game franchise. Now, I'm going to break the pattern a little bit here and talk about a couple games that I think could use sequels, but I think would need some pretty significant changes in said sequels. The first of these is Mython Island, a title that I think has a lot of potential to break through to the mainstream. However, I do think if a Mython Island 2 were to come to fruition, I would like to see the game focus more on its open world mode, which currently makes up about half of the game, and have the sort of Slay the Spire aspect, which was originally what the game was, act more like a post-game facility or activity or something to that extent. I'm someone who feels like a lot of open world games like to have these big empty fields with nothing to do but travel through them. However, Mython Island designs its open world map kind of like how Dark Souls does, in that there's a bunch of winding paths that meet up. There's never big open space that has nothing in it despite it being large. It's kind of maze-like and I love it. I know the monster designs are a little bit divisive. Some people love the designs because they're a lot more, I guess you could say, abstract, while others feel they're a little too weird for them. I personally like a lot of the designs. I don't think the game has the strongest roster, but I definitely don't think it has the weakest either. But the fact that this game was put together by one dude says a lot about the potential of the franchise. Imagine if they had the budget to hire a team to work on this game. As for the plot, honestly, the game was pretty simple in that regard, but I think it worked perfectly, and I'm sure they can come up with any excuse to have us revisit the island. Another game that I'd love to see get a sequel is Abomination, which, if you don't know, is a roguelike title. However, I feel like if they're going to make a sequel, it would be cool to see it become more of a story-driven RPG experience. Now, obviously, this has a lot to do with my own bias and me preferring story RPGs. However, when I think about a sequel to Abomination, another roguelike would be too same-ish, especially since, at least in terms of roguelikes, I think Abomination's one of the best in the genre. So I'd like to see the sequel push the franchise in a bit of a different direction. What I'm thinking is that the next game would still include permadeath, but more of a traditional RPG setting where there's a set world world to explore, and perhaps mechanics within the game that mimic roguelikes, like maybe a dungeon that's randomly generated or portals that lead to randomly generated worlds where you could stock up and loot and do that sort of stuff. That way it doesn't completely stray away from its origins. In terms of the game's plot, it's pretty simple. I'm pretty sure it's every 100 years the same thing happens over and over again. It's kind of part of the story, which, not to mention Dark Souls again, kind of reminds me of their cycles, so they could easily just have another cycle, or maybe a new cycle that aims to break all the cycles or something like that. Okay, so the last two games are a bit contentious, but let me explain. Now, first of all, I think Temtem either needs to support expansions to its game or make a sequel if it's going to continue. Now, you guys can disagree with me on this in the comments, but I feel like if Temtem wants to remain viable in the long term, it's going to need something to bring players back to the game, or they're just going to have to make an entirely new game with new Temtem and new areas, because personally, I don't see people coming back to play just for PvP content. I think the core systems and mechanics of Temtem are fine. The game could be a little less grindy and tone down the trainer battles a bit more than they already did, but I do think that Temtem is a solid IP. They just need to sort of pick a side between being an MMO and a story RPG, because the way I see it right now, the only thing that requires Temtem to be an MMO is the fact that you can see people in the overworld, because every other mechanic in the game could very easily just be some sort of multiplayer thing, like co-op or the raids or whatever. I mean, it's cool to see people in the overworld with their Temtem and their Luma forms, but that kind of gets old really quickly, and since all the battles are turn-based anyways, it's not like RuneScape where you could see people fighting enemies. You're just looking at a bunch of people standing around doing nothing. So I feel like if they are going to make a sequel, I would personally like them to go the single player RPG route, focus more on making a fun and engaging story and less on the PvP scene and economy, especially since Temtem Showdown is a thing too. The idea of people hacking and getting better Temtem and getting a competitive edge doesn't even exist with Temtem Showdown, which, if you don't know, is basically a Pokemon Showdown-esque battle simulator. But I don't know. Let me know what you guys think about this, because I feel like if they're not going to expand the amount of islands on the game or the Temtem within it, a sequel is the only other option to keep the IP alive, because I really don't see people purchasing the Battle Pass in, like, let's say 5, 6, 7 years from now. Finally, last but not least, I'd like to see a game in the same vein as Digimon Survive. It doesn't have to be a sequel, it could be a prequel. In fact, that's probably the easiest way to do it, just because the original Digimon Survive has so many endings, but it'd be really cool to see another game like it, where you play as a new cast of characters, perhaps many, many years before the events of the first game. I don't know if they'd want to go the route of letting you play as the younger version of the old man and his sister, since we already know how that turns out, or if they just wanted to go all the way back and talk about like the birth between the portal and the worlds or whatever. But I feel like if they are going to do a sequel or prequel or game that takes place in a different universe but is still part of the Digimon Survive franchise, I would like to see them expand upon the Digimon roster and add some more complexity to the tactical combat as well. I know Digimon Survive had a lot of contention because a lot of people aren't into visual novels, and I totally get that, but if you can open up your mind a little bit, or at least respect these types of games as their own genre, you could probably see why I think it's another one that would be a lot of fun. But those are just my thoughts, guys. Definitely let me know which Monster Taming games you would like to see receive a sequel. Obviously, I'm not going to include games that aren't out yet, but I'd also like to see games like Cassette Beasts and Lumentil stay within the genre for the long term, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. If you do want to stay up to date on Monster Taming Games, definitely subscribe to this channel. We put out new videos every single day. You can check out my Twitter, Discord, and Patreon linked below. Special thanks to the patrons, especially Jim Hamilton, Dro Ghost, Dark Persona, Exodus, and Candy Morency, and we'll see you next time. Peace.